section right here. One, two, 1, 2, test 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2. Test 1, 2, 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Testing 1, 2, 3.
mean, I think, right, can you be a little... Okay, yeah. Yeah, I'll see what they say. Look, Angela told me they would talk shorter, but Angela said 20, 25 minutes. I'm fine with that. Yeah. Okay. It looks like it's full. This is full. Yeah. Oh, okay. Thank you. Right behind the door.
It's up. If you're more, I think I'm gonna go out there because
I mean,
I think, and then for the conversation,
we could use our mics.
I know the work that we're doing.
Villanova.
Oh, Villanova, yeah, there are a couple other Villanova folks too, yeah.
Should we give you another minute or two, or we could join?
It does look like people are still, I would say it's, I don't know how many people are here, is this the majority?
Yeah, it just looks like people are coming.
Yeah.
Maybe you should say when we get started, or like we're going to start in a minute.
We'll get started in a minute or so, so if you're gathering yourselves, please continue to come in. I trust you all have had an intellectually stimulating day, as I have, such rich discussions on so many different topics related to political theology. If you haven't met me, my name is Vincent Lloyd. I teach at Villanova University in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies and the Africana Studies program, and I co-edit the journal Political Theology. And I have the great pleasure to introduce our moderator for this evening's keynote panel. Inez Radzins is an assistant professor of philosophy at California State University, Stanislaus. Her teaching and research is focused on the intersection of philosophy and politics, feminist theory, and social thought. Dr. Radzins' research is rooted in the French philosopher Simone Weil. She's currently working on a book manuscript on Weil's philosophy of labor. She's been involved with the Political Theology Network since its beginning and co-chairs the AAR's program unit on political theology. And I also add that she leads the Political Theology Network's dissertation workshop, which has been a great experience for me to participate in, and for others, helping cohorts of doctoral students shape their own intellectual projects that Inez has curated. So with that, I'll turn it over to Inez.
Thanks. Thank you, Vincent. And let me just put in a plug for the dissertation workshop. It's too late for this year, but if we do have, if you're a grad student and you're writing in the area, which you might be because you're here, look for our announcement next year. We will be doing another round of dissertation workshops which occur during the AAR. And if you are on the Political Theology Network website, the call to apply for that will be on there in the summer next year. So we're delighted to have with us tonight for a conversation Professor Said and Professor Kung. I'm going to introduce them both. After I introduce them, they will each present some thoughts about political theology. After they each do their their papers or talks, we will all engage in a conversation together. So there'll be time for a lot of question and answer. We want to make this a more conversational format. So at that point, anyone who wants to ask a question, I will be moderating that conversation. So Professor Said is Associate Professor of Interreligious Education, active faculty at the Claremont School of Theology. She's recognized as a leader in peace building and twice received the John Anson Ford Award for reducing violence in schools and in the area of interracial gang conflicts, and was named Southern California Mediation Association's Peacemaker of the Year. She has chaired national conferences on Muslim and interfaith peace building, served as a mediator in many cases, started mediation programs in many institutions, including the University of Southern California and several middle and high schools. Her track record as a peacemaker has made her a sought-out advisor for state, federal, and White House initiatives.
The last one.
And in international conflicts throughout the world. She was formerly the executive director of the Western Justice Center Foundation, founded by Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals Judge Dorothy Nelson. Her research and articles have focused on mediation between law enforcement and communities, intersections of law with religious minority communities, and interfaith just peacemaking. She has facilitated conflict resolution processes for conflicts in schools, community, and environmental and public controversies, and serves as the co-chair of the American Academy of Religion's Religion and Politics section. Professor Kung is Associate Professor in the Department of Cultural and Religious Studies at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and in the Divinity School of Chung Chi College. He also serves as the Director of the Center for Quality Life Education at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, teaches courses on Christian ethics, systematic theology, religion and society, new religious movements, and death and dying. His publications may be found in journals such as Religion, State, and Society, Studies in World Christianity, Social Thought, Political Theology, and Fujian Religious Studies. And he is the author of numerous books. Currently, he is undertaking research on Christian ethics, public theology, and life education. We're delighted to have both of them here for our plenary conversation this evening.
So began the sound when we were in front of the Metropolitan Detention Center where ICE detainees, such as an evangelical pastor in Los Angeles, such as a father ripped away from his daughter as he's dropping her off at school. So we heard these sounds, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, Sikh, clergy, and professors in front of the Metropolitan Detention Center as we're offering in the holy season 3 years ago. For Muslims, it was Isra and Mi'raj. For Jews, it was Passover. For Sikhs, it was Vaisakhi. For Christians, it was Easter. So we heard these sounds as we're offering our prayers, and we become louder and louder as we're making sacred the space in front of this place where not only are ICE detainees incarcerated, but those that are from Los Angeles and picked from our streets are incarcerated. And we wondered, what is this knocking? What is this knocking? And then we realized it was the detainees inserting themselves into our liturgy, inserting themselves into the space where we were making sacred, that place where bodies were snatched and put into this tower. We were hearing the voices of the detainees. That's story number one. Story number two, I crossed the border with clergy and professors of different faith traditions going into Tijuana because if you don't know, there are many Haitian refugees waiting for years for passage to the United States. So we went and we did spiritual care, and what's interesting, no matter what language you speak, when everything is taken from you, you can talk about God in any language. So we went as clergy and we went as community members. We went with unions actually in Los Angeles and offered physical care. But what we found was people wanted spiritual care. So I stood next to a man in the tent city, because they are tent cities. I stood next to a man holding a 9-month-old girl. And I said, well, what a beautiful daughter you have, in my very broken Spanish. And he said, she's not my daughter. I escaped 2 days ago from Mexico, from this part of this region, where her father was murdered in the night. And my wife, who is the brother of her father, we knew we were next. So these are the people that are bringing babies, walking hundreds of miles with their feet, that are described by this administration in words that are used to describe infestations, that are used to describe animals, that are used to describe insects, because we know whenever we study the beginning of ethnic cleansing and genocide, the dehumanization of populations is necessary. So the third story, supporting for many months the encampment in front of the ICE detention center in Los Angeles, clergy went as they did with Occupy. Poilan and Kwok Poilan and Jörg Rieger have talked about this in their books. We went as clergy to support those that were trying to stop the business of ICE. And I went regularly praying, as I do as a Muslim person, as someone to whom my body, Islam, is attached. I went and we offered prayers, Christian prayers, all types of prayers. And one day I got a call from a young man who was there at the encampment and working, because it became again a sacred space. And he said, Najib, I want to tell you, there's a young man. He's ready to kill himself. He's from Guatemala. He may kill himself tonight. Because the state violence of our immigration courts and system, he cannot bear it anymore. He cannot bear the puncturing of his body by the system and the immigration detention that is being threatened upon his body on a regular basis. So what does it mean when we do interfaith rituals in front of spaces such as detention centers? What does it mean when we do rituals of lament? Because deportation is a death for the family. Deportation is a removal, sudden, immediate, constant, particularly in Los Angeles, the targeting of immigration activists. So what does it mean when we have these rituals where we stand together in our tradition? It means that we are looking to re-dignify what has been taken away by the state. It means that we begin to build a liberation calendar every year where we look at the holidays in our traditions and we say, where and when have people struggled for liberation? In our stories, in our ancestral texts, and we bring that into the streets of Los Angeles. So we have now a liberation calendar, not just an interfaith understanding calendar. Our goal in these rituals is disruption of the state. To think of Gene Sharp's work, we try to make it difficult for the state. What does it mean when interfaith ritual looks to interrupt and make inconvenient, to maximize the interruption of the state from the violence on human bodies? What does that mean? What does it mean when we stand in front of Geo Group 3 weeks ago, interfaith leaders, union leaders, all types of leaders, and some people who are just there because it calls to them? Not only are we standing up against the interruption of the state, but we're standing up against the private prison system, which uses the commerce of human bodies to make money. It means we are there to interrupt. So what does this mean for me as someone who teaches interreligious education? What does it mean to take these acts of revolutionary faith-based interruption and disruption done in coalition across religious traditions? It does many things. So I'll speak a little bit here from my upcoming book, and bear with me, this is very emotional for me personally. My 2 70-year-old aunts were just arrested in Kashmir because they were interrupting their bodies in the Indian occupation. So this is a time when elders all over the world, whether it's in Hong Kong or Kashmir, are in the streets as well, many of them protecting our younger people. So liberation theology, as envisioned by scholars like Cohn, have been fundamentally interreligious in their origin, even as the audience for the particular work of one tradition may be perhaps he's writing for Christians, but in fact it's interreligious in its origin. Cone's work exists because he reminded us consistently in his works that he was informed and committed to the ideas of Malcolm X. This fluidity of sources and derivation from them includes liberation-based interreligious learning with opportunities for recognizing how various traditions contribute to the trajectory of scholarship and pedagogies as well. The implications are many. For instance, at Claremont School of Theology, it meant that I and a colleague, Monica Coleman, developed a course on African American Islams because our Christian students were hungry for understanding the ways that Malcolm X and his teachers influenced theologies and scholarships such as James Cone. They had only been taught the work of Christian liberation theologians in isolation without becoming exposed to the other religious sources that inform these works. This was a curricular adjustment and a recognition that to teach Black Christian liberation theology, one had to engage some of its Black Muslim origins. To teach Dr. King, one must engage Gandhi, as John Pitamano here, a contributor to this book, reminds us. He has been teaching a course called Gandhi and King at Union Theological Seminary. In order to study Cesar Chavez, one must engage the discourse between, in his time, Gandhian scholars and the farm workers movement. And the story of the first martyr of the farm workers movement was a Muslim, Nagi Daifullah, who is to this the very first martyr, and he's venerated in regions of California where the farm workers movements were incubated. Nagi died at the hands of Deputy Gilbert Cooper and became a martyr of the strike. On August 17, 1973, 2 days before his death, as many as 10,000 picketers, United Farm Workers members, and supporters marched 4 miles in silence to the memorial service at the United Farm Workers headquarters. A reminder that liberation-based theology and praxis has always been both multi-religious and transnational in its implications and origins. So in my work, what I do in my classroom, I call dignity-based interreligious education that seeks to produce students for engaging in revolution and not civility in their encounter with other traditions. Many interreligious programs in higher education are based on the notion of preparing religious actors and leaders for appropriate civil society engagement. There are many debates on whether the goal is maximal or minimal citizen education. The human rights framing builds the case for diversity of worldviews, and yet it is still built on the assumption that an interreligious learner is moving towards participation in an existing democratic institution or structure. At best, the skills they learn enhance the capacity of collective existence to build democratic institutions. How does one develop a discourse of interreligious learning in which the state is the violent actor? How does one develop a discourse of interreligious learning in which the state is the violent actor? How does interreligious education respond to such a reality pedagogically? And I would articulate that this reality is transnational, and the movements that support state violence are transnational as well. The denunciation of injustice implies the rejection of the use of Christianity to legitimize the established order. Those of you will recognize Gutierrez. And others demand of the interreligious educator an articulation, examination, and revelation of the role of the state in producing violence and educational systems that have its support, as Galtung tells us, the notion of structural violence. What is the role of higher education in supporting structural violence? This structural violence must be addressed by liberation-based interreligious educators, and the role of religion in perpetuating it becomes a part of this analysis. It troubles the notion that there is a consensus on interreligious learning as preparing students for obligatory docility to state structures. or that resolving interpersonal conflicts between individuals, to use the Kungian notion, is the goal of interreligious learning and encounters. Civility is a goal that has been interpreted by scholars such as Gay Teresa Johnson, who points out that people of color don't get to orchestrate the terms of civility. People of color don't get to orchestrate the terms of civility. Instead, we are always induced to respond to it. Invoking civility of discourse as a goal for interreligious encounter for those who experience structural racism and violence, in effect, can silence those communities. Lynn Itagaki goes on to say, civility has been about making sure the status quo hierarchy of the status quo at the moment, at our moment, in this place and in this country, in this city and on this block, which means racial inequity, racial inequality, gender inequality, and class inequality stay permanent. A dignity-based classroom is one in which students may be cultivated for practices that minimize state violence and instrumentalize scholarship, praxis, and theological reflections as tools not just for a critique of the state and academic analysis deconstructing state violence, as tools for not just critique of the state or structures, but also for practice-based encounters that dull the institutional capacities for bias. The civility narrative of many interfaith spaces often dismiss, or they can be allergic to, faith leaders of a community who challenge domesticated versions of their religious traditions. Bolding extends this idea to a cultural level of production. We are not merely seeking individual peace builders. She says, the main point of a peace culture is that it deals creatively with difference and conflict, and that it is a listening culture of peace that needs a lot of place for problem solving. So what we do is create a lot of spaces for problem solving. The dignity-based approach to interreligious learning and encounters is concerned with cultures of violence embodied by individuals in the classroom and the larger social constructs that must be collectively engaged to solve the problems of inequity that affect a whole community. So, essentially here what we're talking about is this notion that within the Muslim tradition and other traditions, karama, the idea of dignity, become deeply embedded as a concept of the work of religious actors and texts. Injustice and its affective dimensions can become fuel for the interreligious encounter itself. Dr. King tells us the supreme task is to organize and unite people so that anger becomes a transformative force. The transformation is the heart of a dignity-based encounter. One acknowledges the injustice present in a context and then develops the tools through interreligious learning to change the conditions of injustice. So I think I will end here, but I wanted to reflect on, I have more pedagogical tools that articulate and come from scholars from the Black Lives Matter movement. But what I wanted to point out here is that political theology that deals with the abstraction of injustice and is only concerned with the notion of protest as having value when we are engaging in merely academic conversations is not only irrelevant to what's happening in the world, but I would also say when we limit our analysis to political theology without the lived protest of theology happening in the streets, we're losing a very rich sense of data that could be brought to the table. So I hope as we go forward we can have more conversations, but I think I'll end there to give my colleague from Hong Kong a chance to speak as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. So I just follow what you have said. You know, the last word you have mentioned saying that political theology has to be done in context and also in action. So what I'm going to say is something talking about what is going on and what is happening right now in Hong Kong. I think that what is happening right now in Hong Kong does provide us a very good context to do political theology. And also it provides a very rich resources for us to rethink the whole issue of political theology. Well, in short, the anti-extradition bill in Hong Kong right now is not a single event, but rather it is a result of a continuous experience of this empowerment of the people in Hong Kong since 1997. What is happening right now in Hong Kong is that, some years ago, you may hear something about what in Hong Kong called the umbrella movement. That is happening in the year 2014. And to a certain extent, the government considered that this event or this umbrella movement was a great defeat to the social activists. And so that's why the government never think about there will have such kind of great scale of protest that is going on in Hong Kong. And even though some of the social activists in Hong Kong, we also never think about that. We have 1 million of people and even 2 million of people coming out for the demonstration in June. So one of the reasons then we have to ask why there are so many people coming out to join the demonstration in June against the extradition bill. One of the main reasons because this bill will totally demolish the legal distinction between Hong Kong and China mainland. So in other words, that the umbrella movement in the year 2014 was talking about the universal suffrage. Even though there is no universal suffrage in Hong Kong, but there is some distinction between China mainland and Hong Kong. But once this extradition bill is passed, the distinction between Hong Kong and China will no longer exist. So this gives the reason why more than 1/3 of the people joined the demonstration in June. And also the reason why the protest is still going on and lasts for more than 4 months now. Now, what I'm going to share with you in the following, I will try to articulate some important points. Is maybe also very important for us to think about the content as well as the methodology of doing political theology. Firstly, according to Charles Taylor, the Western modern social imaginary is categorized by capitalism, civil society, and democracy. It is in this context the political theology is emerged, no matter what kind of form it takes, but this is the context of what we are talking about, political theology in the Western society. But I want to say this is not the social imaginary in Asia. Apart from multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and multicultural, the development of civil society and democracy is not fully developed in Asia, even though capitalism dominates the whole world. But unlike what Charles Taylor talked about, we may have capitalism, but we are lacking of the full scale of development of civil society and democracy. If this is what is happening in Hong Kong and in many parts of Asian societies, then we have to ask, what is the social imaginary for the developing of political theology in Asia? Just take an example of Hong Kong. We may have to ask, what the dominant social imaginary of Hong Kong is, whether the dominant social imaginary is able to sustain the Hong Kongers' experience, what the emergent social imaginary will be, and how it will be emerged, whether it should follow the step of the Western modern social imaginary, and also what the relationship between the dominant and the emergent social imaginary will be. The theological issue here is talking about whether the churches and their theology are supporting the dominant social imaginary, or whether they can be one of the resources for giving birth to the emergent social imaginary features by justice and peace. So that is the first issue. The second issue that I would like to share with you is, when we are talking about the protests in Hong Kong, at the very beginning, this is the protest against the unjust bill. But in this 4 months of protest, the identity of the Hong Kong people has tremendously changed. It is in the participation of protests that the people of Hong Kong come to learn who we are. In Hannah Arendt words, we are who we are in action. Then we have to ask, what are the new identity of the people in Hong Kong in this 4 months of protest? What are the distinctiveness of the Hong Kong's identity? First, I would say it is an identity associated with the land. Maybe for some of the people, identity is not necessarily related to the land, but this is a very important in the experience of the people in Hong Kong. Before 1997, quite a number of scholars mentioned that people in Hong Kong, we live in a borrowed space and borrowed time. So in other words, that the people in Hong Kong at that time, they do not have a sense of belonging to this piece of land. So that's why the issue of 1997 coming up, at least 10% of the people in Hong Kong moved to other countries. And the remaining, those staying in Hong Kong, not because they consider they belong to this land, but they do not have the qualifications or other requirements that is satisfied for immigration. But in this protest, or in this number of years, the people in Hong Kong come to more knowledge about themselves. We are the people in Hong Kong. So that's why some years ago, in the Oxford Dictionary, it gives a new term you can find in the Oxford Dictionary. There is a new term there called the Hong Kongers. Okay? Some years ago, you can't find any words about Hong Kongers. You can only find the word Chinese, British, American. Who are the Hong Kongers? Now, in the Oxford Dictionary, you can find it. And also, some of the airlines, when you book the ticket, you also have to choose which nationality that you are. Most of the airlines will say Hong Kong are the Chinese. But I come across, there is one airline that you can choose Hong Kongers. That is the Ryanair from Ireland. So even though I do not like this airline very much, but because of this, I choose to pick up Ryanair, the budget airline, as one of my favorites, because I know who I am, and also my identity is recognized. So the whole issue in Hong Kong is related to what we are used to say the identity politics. But at the same time, we are also under a threat of worldwide Chinese patriotism. So maybe at the very beginning, people would argue, question such kind of politic identity, whether it would be too exclusive. Well, maybe at the very beginning it is. But for the formation of the identity of the people in Hong Kong, we have to argue from an identity politic perspective. And at the same time, as I share with you, we are also under a threat of Chinese patriotism. Just to want to share with you a story that will be coming up. After this conference, I will be going to Dallas. I will give a lecture in the classroom as well as an open lecture at this university. And I have already received a lot of emails saying to me that you are not welcome. They are from the Chinese Student Association. And they will also say to me that they will try their best to block me getting into the venue. Well, I'm looking forward to see what's going on next Tuesday. And my friends there, they say to me that they have already called the university police to escort me. Hopefully, everything will be fine. My concern here, when I'm talking about the identity politics in terms of the Hong Kong experience, I will also want to share with you there is another kind of identity politics featured by patriotism that is also happening among us. And another thing is related to the whole issue here. Then I'm sure that many of you have read the newspaper talking about the NBA. Well, I do not want to say much here. And you know about this. Whether we have the freedom of speech, whether we are pursuing justice, or whether we are bowing down to money. And this is something also related to the whole issue of identity coming out from the protest. And the third issue I also want to share with you, well, another thing related to all of this is something related to the cultural politics of emotion. Well, people in protest, it's easy to have a sense of hatred. Well, in the morning, I listened to the two presentations talking about the police and the brutality of the police attacking the protester made a lot of the people in Hong Kong very hatred. They are the enemies of the people. Now, we are also in a situation to avoid such kind of hatred turning to be a kind of cultural politics of emotion to dominate the identity of Hong Kong. That is another area we may have to look at from the political theology perspective. The third point that I would like to share with you is that one important resources and task of doing theology is to retrieve the aspirations, hopes, and frustration from the people and interact with them. One of the areas I consider important is the poem. I'm not saying that other aspect is unimportant, but during the protest, not many songs are created. But I come across a lot of poems are created. They are the forms of resistance. However, the poems are not the hidden transcript as mentioned by James Scott, because The poems are open and also public. People can read it, can share with one another. Poem is very individual, but they are not private. It collects people in a very deep sense. They provide a dimension very different from political theory, because the images and the languages employed in poems invite people to imagine, to feel, and also to share with one another. Perhaps I would say this is something about the spirituality of resistance. What I'm trying to say, the spirituality here is not necessarily coming from theology or from churches, but coming from the experience of the people expressed in poem. And this is what Gutierrez is talking about. We drink from our own well. And the fourth issue that I would like to share with you is that this is the first time of the people in Hong Kong to experience the significance of worldwide solidarity. Well, especially in the United States, in the last few days, the people in Hong Kong are so happy to know that the lower chamber of the Congress in the U.S. has passed the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act of 2019. We are not quite sure whether the U.S. president will sign it or not, but at least we are happy that, many of the American people here, they concern what is happening in Hong Kong. They are supporting us, and they show their solidarity with us. And this is a kind of worldwide solidarity that our whole world needs, not only just happen in Hong Kong, but also happen in India, in different parts of the world. So when we are talking about the globalization here, we are talking about the global civil movement here. We know we do not rely too much on the government because in the international relationships, justice is not the main concern. But through the global civil movement, through the interaction with different NGOs, we can give pressure on our government and do something justly for other peoples. Since religious community itself is a global movement, then we have to ask, what are the role of global religious NGO movement? Apart from evangelism, doing some kind of relief work and development, should the religious NGO also pick up a role of advocacy to do something more than just providing services and relief, and showing a kind of solidarity among humans in different parts of the world? That is something political theology should give thought on this. And the fourth and the fifth issue that I would like to share with you is that according to the figure released by the police a week ago, 700 out of nearly 2,400 arrested are aged under 18. Well, you may say, well, there are lots of interpretations. You may say that the police are targeting to arrest the young people. Another interpretation let us know that there are more and more young people joining the demonstration in Hong Kong. They are not only the ones who joined the rally, but they are standing in the front line to confront the police. Many of them, they are young people. Many of them could face further charge of reacting, and the maximum sentence is 10 years. The arrested, especially the young people, have paid a very high price for protecting Hong Kong from falling into one of the cities in China. I think what is happening in Hong Kong is also happening in different parts of the world. We find the young people play a very, very important role for the social transformation of their communities. As said, this happened in Hong Kong. We also think about Malala from Pakistan and Greta from Sweden. They are also the young people. They contribute a lot. They bring new changes or new hope to our society. And this reminds me what Helen Arendt also mentioned, saying that every newborn implies a possibility of newness. The young people will challenge the current norms and logic. Theologically, I would say they are the messiahs. The young people, they are the messiahs. They bring hope to us because they will challenge the logic, challenge the norms, challenge the conventions. But Christian theology also help us to know that these young people are messiahs, but they are also the suffering messiahs. It calls us to show our solidarity and support to our young people. Unfortunately, I'm just thinking to what extent our young peoples are respected and invited to take part in the decision-making of our society. They are the ones to bring the social transformation. But most of the time, in the decision-making, they are not involved in it. When we are talking about the feminist theology, we are talking about the theology of the ethnic groups. Should we also develop some kind of theology of young people? In terms of Messiah, in terms of getting, the decision-making, instead of just only the one to be taken care of. That is the area we also have to think about. The last issue that I would like to draw your attention is that one of the features of the current political movement in Hong Kong is leaderless. In Hong Kong, what we say, be water. And people will say, well, why the political movement in Hong Kong is leaderless? Well, there are lots of reasons behind. I cannot go into details here. But there are some advantages here. Firstly, because there are no leaders, so everyone can contribute something. So in this political movement, we have experienced a lot of imaginations, a lot of creativity that you never think about, a lot of possibilities. And also because of leaderness, the police has no target to arrest. If you are the leaders, the police will targeting you, but everyone are leaders, everyone are playing different part in it, So sometimes making police not so easy to arrest people. It is a good thing. And also because of leaderness, you can listen to or you can choose not to listen because you can also be the leaders. So it makes the whole movement become very flexible, very dynamic. But at the same time, because there are no leaders, if we experience something we consider is not very good, how can we discuss it? I think the whole issue here is related to the use of violence. Sometimes the demonstrator employ violence to achieve something. Maybe it is not a good way of doing this, but how can we discuss this and we do not have a platform to talk about this? Then maybe something is not very good. But that is what's happening right now in Hong Kong. So when we are talking about the political theology, sometimes we focus on ideology as well as world will, even what I have mentioned at the very beginning, the social imaginary. Perhaps it is also good and important for political theology to focus on praxis, especially those tactic and strategy, whether they also play a very important role for forming us some kind of political theology. What I have said so far is based on the context of the Hong Kong experience. But I hope that this Hong Kong experience is not just confined to the experience of the people in Hong Kong, but it's also some kind of experience that can be shared by people also in such kind of situation, protesting, and also in the pursuit of justice and peace. Thank you very much.
So I want to thank both Professor Kung and Professor Said for very interesting comments on two, we were laughing a little bit, two praxis-based approaches. Both of you are concerned with different areas and different conflicts that are happening right now, very real conflicts. So I'm going to open it up, unless either of you wants to ask a question first. You have priority because you're okay. Okay, so let's begin with the audience. I have a mic too. And I'll come down here if anyone.
So my question is the idea of narrative in terms of identity and forming identity. Do the Hong Kong protesters look to the Tiananmen Square and see themselves in the same story, or is that, I'm getting a no right here. And how telling stories about oneself affects that kind of identity formation that you've been talking about.
Well, thank you very much for pointing out the issue of Tiananmen Square, issue. Well, it is a very, very complicated issue in Hong Kong. Now, for instance, like maybe 10 years ago, the people in Hong Kong consider the Tiananmen Square issue that happened in the year 1989 is part of our story. Okay. But some years ago, maybe 7 years ago, something like that, some of the people in Hong Kong, not necessarily the young, they deliberately consider that the Tiananmen issue has nothing to do with the story of Hong Kong. Some kind of argument is going on. The major issue is that if the people in Hong Kong consider the Tiananmen Square issue is part of the Hong Kong story, that means the people of Hong Kong are Chinese. So that's why some people, not many, but some people, they intentionally say that this issue has nothing to do with the story of Hong Kong. This does not mean that, the people in Hong Kong do not need to care or concern about the Tiananmen issue, but rather the Tiananmen Square issue is an issue of violating of human rights. No matter whether you are a British or, a Malaysia or a Burmese, you have to care about this. But this event is not part of our Hong Kong story. I think such kind of conflict or such kind of intentionally to remove this narrative from the story of Hong Kong is a process of recreating or reinterpreting the identity of Hong Kong. Yeah, just the background.
I would also add, one of the reasons the contextuality from the voices on the ground are so important, because protest is now performative, particularly with social media. One of my articles is on the use of Facebook by Muslim women in the Arab revolutions. And so there are layers of that performance. And when there was in some of the Iranian revolutions, the recent revolutions, there were signs in English meant to get to an audience outside of Iran. So that data may be one that is read by others as being relevant to those on the ground. But in fact, it's a very strategic, outwardly focused, a recognition of the international gaze, which at one time meant that there might be some intervention or some knowledge. There is another form of performance that is disciplinary against the diaspora of a community and the home conflict. So as someone who was born in Kashmir, in Srinagar, in the Indian occupied side, watching Modi and Trump together on the stage in one of the largest Muslim South Asian cities in the country, Houston, that is a disciplinary public ritual that says to those that are looking to influence the political system in the United States in favor of one version of liberation, whatever that version may be, it is felt as a disciplinary ceremony against the bodies that seek action in the United States. So I just wanted to point that out, what and how, someone like Malala is very problematic as well as a model of liberation for those that are on the ground, because Muslim women are only celebrated when they're rebelling against Muslim forces of government. So I just am pointing out that it's very important that when we look at symbols in political theology, we analyze the valency based on the world, not just the worldview, but who is the recipient and who is the intended, whether it's for liberation or discipline.
Thank you for your presentations. I think it was a lot to take in. I think maybe that's also why everyone's still grappling with the ideas. I actually reported on the umbrella protest in 2014, so it was very interesting to hear your opinion on how it developed further. And for both of you, I felt that there's a common theme of domination, how do people counter domination, and how do we deal with it in political theology. So my question to both of you would be more like a conceptual question, what do you think is the relationship between political theology and liberalism or liberal ideologies? And can you have a conservative political theology, or is it always liberal?
Well, and can I just add something to the end of that, which is, and to what extent are, and I'm thinking of the states here, are our policies... Microphone. And to what extent are our policies of sort of resistance or activism related to liberal policies? They come out of often and are developed within. So, and I think still related to sometimes.
Right. Let me say in this way, as my presentation, I start very beginning, I think the whole issue is something related to the social imaginary. So that is to say, so I'm asking is what the social imaginary, for instance, like in Hong Kong, when we are talking how we are related to one another, how we are expecting, from one another, what is the social imaginary? And what I'm thinking is that it is so important for political theology, not just upholding some kind of values, no matter whether this is a liberal values or not, upholding some kind of values, and to use this kind of values as a reference to challenge any other kind of values that is against this. Now, I'm not saying that it is unimportant to uphold some kind of values, for instance, like human rights or justice, something like that. But it is important to look at the context of the society, whether because there are some kind of I use the word social imaginary, that is shaping the way of the people of thinking. Okay. Even though that is give the reason why, even though they are upholding the understanding of human rights and democracy, but they have a very different interpretation of this because of the influence and the dominance of their social imaginary. So it is so important to look at those issues when we are developing some kind of political theology in order to respond. So that is my concern here.
I think absolutely you can have a conservative political theology. And I think as we speak comparatively here, if we're articulating across the lines of religion, for instance, one of the great debates right now in the American Muslim community is between this idea of resistance and whether that is a project that has theological basis in the tradition, and a camp that is saying, if you look at Wala, I think Qisay is her name online, her work, and then others who are looking at, for instance, the quietude or the notion, in some ways maybe even rooted in mysticism, of American Muslim leaders who are saying engagement with the state, even Donald Trump's state, are important, and that politics of obedience are important, and that is a Muslim value. So we have this internal discourse of a conversation that's happening in real time in a responsive theology to the state, and what does it mean that we engage with the state at the moment. So whether you put that along conservative or liberal ideas, it's fascinating because the accusations by those who are promoting the notion of engagement with the state, whether it's sitting on some of the commissions that Trump has named people to, he actually named a Muslim leader to one of them, sometimes the reaction is, well, you want to do this resistance, you want to do this anti-state work because it's a liberal project. So we're finding, this idea that obedience to the state is an Islamic value, and resistance to the state is a value that you've taken outside from the Muslim tradition. It's not from the Muslim tradition. So I think it's fascinating to watch that conversation unfold, because those that are engaging in acts of resistance find a deep theological basis for their work as well. So what does it mean? Who is a Muslim? And what is the Muslim's relationship to a state when that state is banning their bodies from entering the United States as well? So we could talk more about that, but we are seeing a crystallization of positions in response to what the state is doing, and a production of political theology that is theologizing the state as well and its sacral elements, but also in a constant, in-the-moment response.
Perhaps maybe I can just give you an example here. For instance, like when I look at the social imaginary of the Chinese politics. So it seems to me, well, this is my interpretation. The Chinese politics, or the social imaginary of the Chinese politics, is what I call the metaphor of parent and child. When we are talking about the return of Hong Kong to China, well, that is the return, or the legal document, the legal word we'll use to resume the sovereignty. Well, that is the word sovereignty that we have used in this morning, to resume the sovereignty over Hong Kong. This is a legal term. But in the Chinese government used a very different term. In Chinese called 回歸, that is to return to the homeland, return to the mother. Well, when the Chinese government used the parent-child metaphor as the social imaginary, it is a very, very Chinese. That is to say, all what the parents are doing are for the sake of their children. Okay, what the mother hope is to embrace this lost child, and also what the child need is to return to the mother. So a kind of very sentimental, very kind of feeling, you know. So this is why when the people in Hong Kong say, well, I do not want to return to China, people will say to you that you are unpatriotic because of the social imaginary of parent and child metaphor. Now, what is happening right now in Hong Kong? We are not just talking about the liberal values. We are saying that we are no longer child. We are no longer children. We are adults now. Please don't use parent language. Say to us that you have to listen. Your mom loves you so much. Okay, then you have to be obedient. We are adults. We are in a position to stand for our own. We want to be independent, something like that, you know. So what I'm arguing, saying that, well, when we are talking about the political theology, we do not need to be bound by the liberal values, but we are in a position to discern and to argue whether the current or the existing social imaginary is able to sustain the experience of the people right now. So that is why the Chinese government never quite understand what the people in Hong Kong think. They are just saying that, well, you know, the people in Hong Kong, they are too lofty, you know, they are naughty child, they do not, you know, they do not behave well. But they never know that we are no longer children. We are an adult. Yeah. So this is something going beyond the whole ideas of liberal values.
Would you say that is the social imaginary in Hong Kong? That we are adults? Is that the...
And I would also argue that a lot of the young Muslim leaders that are on the front lines of organizing against programs like combating violent extremism programs, state surveillance, a lot of them are engaging in rhetoric that questions the notion that Muslims are ungovernable. Because there is an internalized Islamophobia produced, in fact, by political theologians who've written quite often here in the United States and adopted by some Muslim leaders, the notion that Muslims inherently are ungovernable and they should not govern on their own. So we began to see some Muslim leaders who are openly saying, I support constitutional monarchies. So there is a conservative relationship between monarchies emerging as well as American Muslims living in a democracy around a support of Muslims are ungovernable, so why should we allow them to govern themselves? So younger Muslim leaders are articulating a rebellion against that notion because it has been internalized into the discourse and the interpretation of our own sources as Muslims. This notion that Muslims cannot govern themselves, whether they be in Iraq or whether they be in South Central Los Angeles. There's something why we know that 10% of the prison population in the United States is Muslim. We are overly represented. Muslims face, in prison, particularly African American Muslims, face not just incarceration, but punitive actions because of their religious beliefs and the tie between the war on terror and the war on drugs. So I just want to point that out, I think, as well. The ungovernability of Muslims is also racialized, not just by the war on terror, but by the war on drugs as well in the United States. And this rhetoric finds itself in transnational movements with the inability to see Muslims as victims. And the capacity in naming the objects of suppression, surveillance, whether we're talking about China as well, by naming it a Muslim problem, it gives the capacity and the inability to see people as victims. In addition, it gives a policy opening for integrating the types of surveillance mechanisms that have been used on the war on terror and the war on drugs transnationally. I could talk more about that in Southeast Asia and other places where this has been replicated, but let's move on.
My question is for Lap Yong Kung. I'm curious how you navigate the tension between a form of political theology on one hand that is very suspicious of colonialism and imperial interventionism. So that's one end of a tension. How does that relate in your thinking to the desire for a relationship between Hong Kong and the United States that uses American power to bring about a change in the relationship between Hong Kong and China? I consider myself to be a kind of liberation theologian, and within that form of thought, there is a complicated aversion to American interventionism, using the occasion of civil rights violations to therefore rally and use American soft and hard power and other types of coercion to affect relations between nations outside of the United States' jurisdiction. So I'm curious if in your thought and in your understanding of political theology, is there an engagement with that tension to any extent?
Yes, thank you very much for pointing out the issue here. Well, you know, it is a, how can I say, you know, now, I think it can be understood in a very two different sense. The first sense, as I mentioned in my presentation, I would consider, you know, the involvement of the United States government, you know, in the Hong Kong issue. For instance, like, as I said, you know, the Human Rights and Democracy Act, you know. I think if we see this from a global civil movement, that is a kind of global solidarity. It is going beyond, you know, the concern of colonial or imperialism and something like that. Because when we are talking about the global civil movement, it is based on the solidarity of human rights. So even though, you know, the people in Hong Kong, they are asking for some kind of support from the United States government, you know, for some of the people in Hong Kong, they would consider that, you know, that is nothing related to the colonialism or imperialism, but it is a kind of global social solidarity with one another. On the contrary, the Chinese government would have a very different interpretation. The Chinese government would consider this as a kind of foreign intervention into the Chinese domestic affairs. That is something unwelcome or something should be criticized. So that is from another perspective to look at this. So from the Chinese government, it was considered that, you know, the support coming from the US government, especially on this Human Rights Act, is a kind of continuation of the colonialism as well as the imperialism. So that is from a very two different kind of perspective to look at the issue here. Now, if we are talking from the political theology, it seems to me that I would put emphasis on the global civil movement. I would see, the support coming from not necessarily from the United States, but from some other countries, because we are one. And theologically speaking, this is something talking about the ecumenical spirit. So I would argue from this perspective, not necessarily in terms of colonial or imperial, such kind of intervention into Hong Kong. Because at the same time, when we are talking about colonialism or the post-colonialism, the people are not in an equal status. But right now in Hong Kong, the people asking for this, we are also in an equal status. This is one of the means to protect, the autonomy of the people in Hong Kong. So I will argue in this way from an ecumenical perspective.
Thank you both for your presentations. Dr. Saeed, you mentioned in one of the stories that you opened with that during a spiritual practice or a religious ritual outside of the ICE detention center, the group that was there created and returned dignity to those who were being detained. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the prospects and the limits of spiritual practices for social political resistance and change. Maybe another way of asking the question is, what kind of attention do spiritual practices and rituals warrant from political theology?
I think that's an excellent question, and I just wanted to make sure that we weren't returning dignity to the people that were incarcerated, but the idea of coming together was to engage in what I call dignity-based practices. And I would encourage you to look at, there's a recent article by Moore and Kim on dignity-based interfaith encounters that has just come out, which I spend more time on in my book. But the notion, and I mentioned the word dignity because it also came up in the analysis around the Arab revolutions. The word that came up, you do a cloud or you look at the words that come up. Prashad's work and other, Mael Hassan, who edited a volume of the Voices of the Revolutions, it wasn't a transactional notion of human rights, of gaining retributive justice, of gaining a loss. It was this notion of what is ephemeral in some ways, hard to quantify, hard to measure, but this notion of dignity. And in particular, I mention it because I think sometimes the term liberation, for some communities that are high context, as Edward T. Hall describes some communities, high context, liberation sometimes when translated, because I do my work in multilingual contexts, sometimes means and sometimes sounds to people as autonomy away from community, because it comes particularly imported from English and the Western context. It can be interpreted as liberation from away, a collective notion. You can, Saba Mahmoud's work also looked at some of that, the idea of communal ethical cultivation in politics of piety. So I'm just giving you a sense of all these words that we use, terms that have a valency of liberation in one context may mean something different when translated, such as the word occupation as well, translated into multiple languages, whether it's Arabic, Kashmiri, looking at the context. I'd be happy to talk to you more about that. I think that the notion of spiritual practices need a lot more attention because rituals create micro, or in my work I call episodic empathy. So when people are engaging in the ritual collectively, particularly in a multi-religious setting, it allows not just for the object of prayer, the community that you are reflecting, the community that you are supporting, but it creates a visual image. I had a visual image of our protest that because of, I guess this, we're in a church or chapel, we weren't able to project it, but you would be able to see Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Sikh, and other practitioners, and I'm in the middle of reciting the Quran in a very, I guess what I was told, it looks like I was about to speak in tongues, mode by someone yesterday at McCormick Seminary when I keynoted. And that visual, as I've written about in my articles, has an impact because what you see is people coming together, not just for spiritual practices of liberation, but it shows the capacity of us to utilize and instrumentalize religion in a collective voice for the liberation of whether it's my community or another. I often tell my students one of the most powerful moments is when you work with someone and stand with them when you believe they're going to hell. That's actually one of the most powerful moments of solidarity. Solidarity is not me believing that you go to heaven, and that's solidarity. To me, when two people who across the table, literally that's their belief and they hold on to that belief, and that's why I just wanted to mention that for the conservative theologies. There are people who hold on to those bounded, tethered to text theologies that are able to do this work. This is not work in which there has to be one universal theology of religions to engage in, and I think unfortunately that has been the assumption. That's why I think spiritual practices need attention. When women in front of Jantar Mantar in India are praying because of the disappearance of a young boy 3 years ago, and they're making the salah, the prayer, the Muslim prayer, and when we did it in the airports also when we were being detained, there were weeks when we didn't know who was going to get off the airplane or not. But we made a point of praying in the airports because it was a reclamation of space, and our Christian brothers and sisters protected us. So they were a part of the Muslim prayer. They were a part of our praying and taking over the space of airports where it was essentially people were being detained and deported and an invisible wall was created. So I think spiritual practice needs more attention because it allows for us to look at political theology, not just doctrine, but as an embodied capacity to stand for one another in the most holy, particularly in Muslim ritual, what doesn't change in the last 1400 years is worship. We hold on to worship exactly as it was done in the last 1400 years. There are different schools of thought. But the act of worship brings God not just to the table, not just to the circle, but it says, in the moment when I am most holy, I am standing with others, whether I have skin in the game or not. And that's a profound notion of a political, theological moment that's transformational across generations.
May I ask a question? Thanks.
Yes, you Vincent, can.
Thanks. I can see how there's something very powerful about seeing in calling moments of protest spiritual or theological. Something very rhetorically powerful about that, something that brings people together and that opens them to challenging systems of domination in their world because of that language that's used. I guess I wonder about the criteria by which protest gets that label, right? Is it all anti-state protest that gets that label, or protest that can be put into where you can tell a story about how it's challenging the state? Because certainly there are protests that one can imagine, that I'm sure we can all imagine, that might look spiritual or theological, but we wouldn't want to say maybe you're idolatrous or something like that, or maybe don't have anything to do with religion, or going, the label isn't apt. So, I mean, are there criteria from religious or theological traditions that we would want to bring to that, or are there criteria from Marxism or critical theory that we would want to bring to making those judgments, or how do we make those judgments?
So I think you raise a really good point, and one of the interventions in my work that has been helpful is studying indigenous traditions, particularly the notion of protest as worship, and this idea that, that in Standing Rock, the ritual of protest doesn't necessarily look like it does for what the Abrahamic traditions often frame. And I say that because it is also a deep critique of capitalism in that moment as well, because the actor that one is responding to isn't the state necessarily, but the state by proxy through corporations. So I think that's a helpful analysis, because as we do comparative work, I think what constitutes religion and what constitutes spiritualities also needs to be analyzed. And I think we still have, and I don't know who's in that we, sometimes I wonder who is in that we, but as one analyzes this idea of what constitutes a ritual that is religious or spiritual, very often prayer that has a liturgy is privileged. So I think that's we're constructing religion even as we're speaking about protest itself. And so in my work, I've found it's important to do comparative work that engages indigenous traditions and looks at prayer in ways that doesn't have to be externalized through ritual, through conversation, through speaking, through identifiable motions. So I'm saying that indigenous traditions certainly do that as well. What happens when we come very often with a political theological lens that is either whether our starting point, as some scholars would say, our starting point is Abrahamic, I think we do favor and we do privilege particular liturgies. So I wanted to say that because I think part of what's emerging are also multi-religious rituals that challenge the liturgies of their traditions as well. Bernie Sanders just had a heart attack. There's a Muslim WhatsApp group of millennial Muslims who did a prayer. They finished reading the Quran for a Jewish candidate for the United States of America, right? I mean, that's a fascinating thing to think about. What does that mean when a collective ritual within the Muslim tradition is said for someone who's not within that tradition? But the motivation is not a religious affinity. The motivation is a political aim. So I think you pose a really good question that ritual and liturgy, we need to interrogate what constitutes liturgy, what constitutes religion as it's constructed in these spaces, and to know that there can also be violence done in these forms of multi-religious rituals. They're not always peaceful rituals. Sometimes people are erased. Sometimes communities are invisibilized. So as we construct these rituals and violence in response to violence, they themselves might in fact be agents of continuing invisibility of minoritized traditions within each community as well. So we could go on about that, but I think you raise a point that needs a lot more interrogation to think about whether we're creating and reifying established forms of religion and privileging certain forms of religion when we see a ritual that looks familiar and comfortable to us.
For instance, I think political theology can help the protest to move into another dimension. For instance, I just give an example here. For instance, like when I'm talking about the protest in Hong Kong, from a I think more, maybe 90% of the people joining the demonstration, they are not Christians, okay? So they are not, they're joining the demonstration not because of the religious values, but from a political theology perspective, I would see what is going on in Hong Kong is some kind of messianic movement. Now, let me just give some examples here. Well, it is a kind of messianic, that is a kind of secular and theological exegesis. Okay. Now, for instance, when talking about the whole idea of sovereignty, well, in the morning we have some good papers talking about, the understanding of sovereign as the one who has the power to announce the stage of exception. Now, when we are talking about Jesus as the Lord of history, now most of the time when we say God is the Lord of history, should we also understand this as a matter of exercise sovereign, instead of the Lord of history is understood in terms of guidance, directing, holding what the future would be. But this political movement helped me to have a very different interpretation of what God as Lord of history should be understood as the one is the sovereign. So this is why God has the decision to announce this is the day of salvation and the judgment. This is exactly what sovereign is about. So that is the political movement itself help me to have a better understanding of political theology, as an example as God as the Lord of history. And on the other hand, the experience of the Christian theology when we are talking about Jesus as the sovereign. The sovereign that Jesus expressed is not in terms of political power, but this is a kind of power of suspension. That is what we also discussed. So even though such kind of power may not be fully actualized, but it is a power of suspension. So that's why when Jesus, under the investigation of Pilate, he said that, my kingdom is not in this world, so that's why I do not need to listen to what you have said, That is what Jesus so expressed his sovereign as the power of suspending what the Roman law is and what the Jewish laws are. I think such kind of theological understanding is so helpful for the movement. Because maybe some of the demonstrator, their goal is to separate Hong Kong from China, or to prevent Chinese government intervention into the Hong Kong everyday life. But I would say, maybe finally all this kind of protest would not succeed because it is so powerful of the Chinese government. And also Hong Kong is still under the one country of two system. Does it mean that the people in Hong Kong, we have nothing to achieve? I would say that even though at the end we cannot achieve something in terms of politically, but the people in Hong Kong can also experience a certain extent of sovereign. Because at least in the last few months, and maybe in the coming days, we have the power to suspend. That is not to listen to what you have said. We have our own lives. Even though politically and physically we are not able to do it, but to a certain extent, we have the ability, we believe that, or we even exercise that, we can suspend. I think that is some kind of political theology can contribute to the movement, not to give the legitimation, but to help the protesters to think through the whole issue of what we are doing. So this is just as an example that I would like to share with you here.
And your question brings up the unscripted nature of ritual. So in Sudan, when women are leading through dance and music, in Los Angeles, when a Muslim woman is leading the liturgy of against state violence, it also relocates spiritual authority in that moment. But it also creates a power accumulation for women through protest. While they may not be, and this is the issue, they're not talking about gender. The issue is not necessarily gender or gendered, or about access to education as Malala. There are so many ways in which that moment, that theological moment, impacts not just the reaction to the state, but reorganizes the religious communities that are dealing in that moment of rebellion itself. It's never the same. after you have had that moment happen. And when that moment is captured and shared, the Sudanese woman on top of the car was the most shared picture. She's not impacting, this is what I found in my work with looking at Muslim countries, particularly the Arab revolutions. It wasn't the social media impact, wasn't that women in Saudi Arabia trying to get the right to drive were actually learning, were themselves finding the projection, but the solidarity of seeing women do actions in other countries gave them a feeling that they're not alone and that they had the capacity to relocate spiritual authority within their own liberation. So I just wanted to point that out as well, that religion is moving and dynamic and never the same after those moments of protest, even if the protest is the state and gender is not at the table as the main issue.
Okay, well, I would like to thank our panelists for a fascinating conversation. And invite everyone to the reception afterwards. Right in the back, Vincent.
And just one short announcement. I've been asked to let you know that there's a photography exhibit as part of the conference called Rising from the Death of Deportation that can be found in Union Theological Seminary here. Please, in the rotunda. Please enjoy the reception.
people came, more or less? About 100 people?
I think a little over.
So we had 250 registered and 68 unclaimed name tags.
Oh, fantastic.
That's a good.
Okay, this one's not turning on.
So a bit more at the top.
Okay, that's good. And this one is that's good. Okay, thank you. Good morning. We're just getting ready to start. We're not going to start quite yet as people are still making their way forward, but what I'd like to do is ask if you could all move forward so that we could eliminate some of the empty space between us, and maybe those in the back could come up so that the people in the middle can stay where they are, and just fill, yeah, thank you. Thank you for leading the charge. So we're going to ask if you could just not be bashful, come on up where we can see you. This will also help us with our Q&A and passing of the mic. This will help a great deal. Thank you. Sorry, that's a little far. I want you to know that your class is very full.
I see it.
Be careful. Maybe I could get into this.
That's okay.
You're okay?
I'll do it.
Good morning, afternoon. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here to our final event of this. It's the final event, yeah? No, yeah. Lunch, yes. No, the lunch. Stay around for the lunch. The final keynote of this conference. We hope you have had a wonderful weekend, last couple of days, and I'm really excited to introduce our two final panelists for the conversation. It's been a rich conversation already. They've been talking over the last 20 minutes, and I've just been like, this is great. Let us just kind of keep going with this. My name is Brandy Daniels, but to introduce folks who many of us already know and know of and have read their work. Gil Anidjar is professor in the departments of religion, the departments of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies, and the Institute for Comparative Literature and Society at Columbia University. His interests include political theology, race and religion, Christianity, rhetorical exertion, and continental philosophy. The author of at least 5 books, amongst them The Jew and the Arab, and Semites, and most recently, in English at least, Blood, A Critique of Christianity, an author of untold other things, also named as one of the 101 most dangerous academics by David Horowitz, which is an honor. Silvia Federici is Professor Emerita of International Studies, Women's Studies, and Political Philosophy at Hofstra University. She's an Italian-American scholar, teacher, and activist from the radical autonomist feminist Marxist tradition. the author of at least 6 books in English, amongst them Wages Against Housework, The Caliban and the Witch, and Re-Enchanting the World, Feminism and the Politics of the Common, also the author of Untold articles. Silvia Federici has worked as a teacher in Nigeria for many years and is the co-founder of the Committee for Academic Freedom in Africa, also the co-founder of the International Feminist Collective and organizer of the International Wages for Housework campaign. I thought this conversation was particularly apt. It's Halloween is coming up soon, and we're talking with folks who have done things on blood and witches. In light of this wonderful conference we have, we're going to have a great conversation about kind of the state of the field and what political theology is and what it can do or what it does and how to contend with kind of the place of political theology in the academy and in the public sphere today. So I will stop talking and let you listen to them. They're both going to talk for about 10 to 12 minutes. And then have a conversation between them that I'll try to help just field and guide, and then open it up for conversation with all of us. So without further ado.
Shabbat Shalom. I'm very happy to be here. I do want to begin, though, by thanking the Political Theology Network for thinking that I was an appropriate speaker for the final conversation. And I want to thank in particular Andrea White, obviously, Vincent Lloyd, and absolutely. Vincent Lloyd and Winfield Goodwin, who continue to impress me. I also want to say that I'm deeply, deeply honored to share the stage with Silvia Federici, whose Caliban and the Witch and Re-Enchanting the World are, among other publications, have really, really impressed me. I should say, for the sake of honesty, that until I was announced that I was going to be in conversation with Silvia, I had not read Re-Enchanting the World. In a kind of marathon, I've been reading it over the past few days, and it's been amazing. And so for those of you who haven't looked at it, part of me just wants to say, I'm going to shut up now and maybe ask Silvia to talk about this book, and maybe that's what I'll end up doing, but I don't want to completely be silent, because of congenital and professional inability to do that. We thought, since Silvia wasn't able to be here over the past 2 days, that that my remarks might do something like give my sense, however unjust, given that obviously I haven't attended all the panels. No one could have, since they were going on at the same times. But given the panels that I was able to attend, to give something like a summary of sort, or of an account of sort. And I will say that I'm deeply skeptical of fields and disciplines, however formatted by them I am myself, of course, of institutional gatherings. And one of the reasons for that is because I worry about their conatus. I worry about the persistence, the inclination to persist in their beings of institutional frames, the moment where whatever impetus there might be becomes institutionalized and established, may enable conversation, that's where I'm going now, may enable conversation, but may also restrict them simply by virtue of perdurance, of continuing. But I will also say that I am very grateful, and a few people have said that, and German Ross Adam actually was speaking to us yesterday about transgenerational conversations. I was telling him how happy I was that he mentioned the word transgenerational without using the word trauma afterwards, but rather transgenerational conversations might be a way to think, and the kinds of conversation that happen in the political theology network, the friendship and complicity and synergy that I have found, and I even go so far as to mention some names again: Andrea White, obviously, Vincent and Dana Lloyd, Catherine Keller, Beatrice Marowich, Jermaine Ross Allen, Desmond Coleman, Winfield Goodwin. I'm singling you out because the conversations that we have been having for a while now are very important to me. My sense, my frustration, nevertheless, with the conversation, I think, started on the first evening, where obviously an impromptu panel, which was absolutely amazing because it was impromptu and because it was actually genuinely amazing, managed to do something for which I myself am guilty of, which is to mention only one religious tradition. I don't think I'm wrong in saying that, although Karen Bray mentioned that she is not a Christian. I don't think there was any other so-called religious tradition that was actually mentioned. And that in itself was kind of amazing. I'm certainly not going to disagree with the notion that we must think about Christianity, and as some of you know, I don't think Christianity is a religion, or if it is the only one and there are no others, and we should not call any other tradition religions. But more productively, to think that Christianity is a religion is actually the worst kind of essentialism. Christianity is not a religion, it is political theology. It is also the distinction between oikonomia and government. It is in fact an apparatus that involves a transformation of the world in a large way. And the fact that we think of it as a theological tradition, as a religion, in fact, is one of the most significant sleight of hands that could have happened. Which would be why, aside from the fact that I do think that in a moment like this, and some of the difficulty has to do with the possibility of defining the urgency, and Silvia and I were already talking about the fact that to name the enemy capitalism is an imperative and an urgency that is undeniable, at the same time as capitalism doesn't do quite all the job if one doesn't understand that capitalism is also a racial regime. And many of us are still doing the work that is necessary. I'll include myself, may not be fair, still doing the work that is necessary to understand under capitalism a racial regime, right? And that the division of race and religion, for example, which is also something where work continues to have to be done, may or may not be subsumed under that name. We also have, of course, colonialism, right? We also have modernity, colonial modernity. Is there another kind? I don't think so. But even in that moment, the term that we use in order to understand what it is that we are struggling against is a problem. And so the difficulty I have, and perhaps there is one way for me to summarize what it is that I've heard, is the eagerness, on the one hand, to globalize political theology, to talk about political theology as if it is, in fact, some kind of universal, not just an entryway, but rather even a descriptive, right? And you all know those huge volumes on political theologies that will tell you about the political theology of Bali. And I think that something might be lost after we have learned how much the dissemination and the translation, the globalization of religion by Tal al-Assad, by Tomoko Masuzawa, by Guy Strumza, and a few others, after we've learned of the imperialist dimension of that globalization, we take political theology and we just send it out in the world everywhere. And that lack of worry about the translatability of political theology is one of my frustration, and I took it, again, I don't want at all to be unfair to the opening panel, but I took it that the fact that Islam, in a moment like today, was not mentioned by name. Islam and Muslims, Islamophobia, were not mentioned in an opening conversation on political theology. I take it to be symptomatic, even if it is absolutely not a justified criticism of any of the speakers that were on the panel. I just want to be clear, yes? But that involved the questions as well. On the other hand, and again, to give you my sense, and I'll finish with that, of what many of the conversations have been. And just now in a panel on journalism, political activism, and anti-war, the necessity of being Americanocentric is absolutely clear. The asymmetric power of the United States as a cipher for capitalism is absolutely undeniable. For capitalism, for modernity, for diplomacy, even though that word, of course, as you know, doesn't mean anything by now, especially if you've read Trump's letter to Erdogan. But nonetheless, for the presence of the UN and the World Bank and the IMF in this country requires a kind of Americanocentrism. At the same time, America is not America. I don't need to tell anyone here. And yet, so much of the conversation was still Americanocentric in, I felt, the wrong or the limited sense of the term. Not to recognize that America is the world, that it has taken over the world, right? The conversation about Hong Kong yesterday, as about the Arab Spring. Is this an American intervention already or not? Without, of course, denying agency, but I continue to be amazed by how much agency we continue to grant ourselves at the same time as we recognize how powerless we are, at the same time as we, of course, don't want to be completely tragic and not recognize that we are without agency, but nonetheless to recognize that our agency has been so fundamentally curtailed by colonialism, modernity, capitalism, Christianity, however we want to name it. And so the question of what it means to criticize America, to give it another name, is to me a question. And again, the Americanocentric, and I know none of you deserve the pseudo-critique that I'm articulating now, and nonetheless, it's a worry, right? So the globalization, the translatability of political theology, at the same time as the notion that we must talk about America, not because it is everywhere, but because it is here. And it's the fact that it's here that I'm not so certain about, and what it might mean to grant that it is not. I'll just finish with the fact that one of the things that I take to be an extraordinary and important provocation in Silvia's work has to do with the new enclosures, with the fact that we are witnessing, and we have been for a while, witnessing a new stage of primitive accumulation, which is also concomitant with the fact that Silvia's main, if I may translate, main criticism of Marxism is in fact that Marxism is a progressivism, that Marx tried to convince us that the destruction that is wielded by capitalism ultimately brings us to a new and good place. And Silvia offers a great corrective, which is, no, sorry, capitalism is destructive, and whatever we need to get to is not by way of capitalism. We need to let go of capitalism as an instrument, ultimately, that brings us, that will bring us to a better place. And one of the sides of the critique is how new enclosures are multiplying. And I think new enclosures, and again, that will be a translation, new enclosures are a much better expression than an expression that otherwise I have adopted since conversations about the election, namely echo chambers. We all live in echo chambers, and I think academics in particular live in echo chambers. But to think of ourselves as living in new enclosures at the same time, of course, as we have been expropriated from land and all kinds of other things, maybe another way of thinking about what I've been trying to say, namely that we need translation, and yet we must really worry about translation. Yes, we must be able to engage with a planetary situation. The environment has become another name for it, better than the destruction of the environment, better than global warming, because it feels like, we're just all going to be a little cozier. Global warming, as you know, is in fact a marketing ploy, yes, in order not to talk about the destruction of the environment. Microplastics have nothing to do with global warming in themselves, but they are destroying life, yes, all over the ocean. They are an effect of oil. But so to think of new enclosures as where we are also stuck and how to unstuck ourselves from there. Thank you. I don't know if I took more than 10 minutes, but I look forward to hearing. Thank you.
It's this one. Good morning, and thank you first of all to Vincent Lloyd for inviting me to this gathering. And I'm very sorry I was not able to participate in any, just briefly, in a very interesting panel this morning. And so here I am, not really knowing what kind of discussion has taken place. So I will make my comments more brief and then engage, the question period. And what I'll do, I'll tell you what is on my mind today when I think of political theology, and just a few points that I think are actually of great concern to me. First of all, I come from a feminist tradition. I've been working in a feminist perspective, feminist movement, however defined, it's a long, complicated story, for many, many years. And I belong to a tradition, of course, has been very, very suspicious, if not antagonistic, to the history of Christianity, because the history of Christianity, particularly as a church, has been a history of compromise with power. And also because theologically, in many ways, presumes a relationship between the divine and humanity, which is very hierarchical, which is very patriarchal, which is, in a way, implies a relation of subjection, implies a perennial, eternal state of exception. So from that point of view, I come from a tradition that has been, again, very critical. I've written a lot in this book that has been mentioned, Caliban and the Witch, about the witch hunts. The witch hunts, they took place in Europe and then exported to Latin America and eventually other parts of the world by missionaries. And so, that whole story, in fact, I'm very, very much engaged with it now. I have projects in different places to recuperate the history of the witch hunts, which I think has been really erased, cancelled. Nobody in school has studied what the witch hunts have been about. In a few days, you're going to have all kinds of children going around the city with trick or treat. I've traveled to places where women have been burnt, and I've seen that they've turned into tourist spots. The Inquisition image of the witch has been used to attract tourists. Everywhere you see the old woman with the satanic smile and the broom, flying over the air, and is used to really sell the place to the tourist, a disgrace. It's something that is unimaginable with any other kind of persecution. So I'm still very involved with that story and making the connection to the present, because there are still witch hunts taking place of all types, including real witch hunts in many parts of the world where women are still being accused. And this is one of the points I want to raise, in my discussion. So I come from a old tradition that does not refuse, on the contrary, looks for different forms of spirituality, and looks at forms of spirituality that are more inclusive, that are not hierarchical, and they are based, on care, respect, empathy for everything that is living, that somehow connect more with the heretical tradition that was flourishing in Europe in response to the struggle against the heretic, that basically said God is in all of us, more pantheistic view of the world. But in terms of what my concerns today are, I want to mention two things that are very important. And, one is the witch hunts that are taking place. I think if we talk about political theology, we really need, those who are committed to a different interpretation of political theology than the one embraced by Carl Schmitt, then I think we have to be concerned about the way religion is being used politically today. I come from a month-long trip through Brazil and also Argentina, but mostly in Brazil, and the question of the way the Protestant sects, some Pentecost, I don't want to generalize, of course, but evangelical, Pentecostal, are spreading a conception of, basically, again, a conception of life, a conception of social relation that is very, very destructive, that, in fact, is fomenting, attacks on women in particular, but not only, and, legitimizing the right of the state, to adopt very repressive social politics and to extend its control over the body of women. This is also taking place in Africa. I lived in Africa in the 80s, in Nigeria, and I saw those sects arriving and going to the marketplace and proselytizing with all kinds of discourses that, again, were extremely divisive of people, sowing suspicion in communities, and basically preaching a very individualistic, individualizing, perspective, conception of social relation, right? In fact, very much part. In fact, at that time, it was clear that their message was very much part of the new enclosure, right? The attack on communitarian relation, and again, introducing into religious discourse the theme of the devil, the theme of a satanic conspiracy, and as with very, very murderous consequences. So I would really encourage, any discussion of political theology to take into account the way religion is being used today as the handmaid, and particularly Christianity, as the handmaid of neoliberal expansion, the expansion of capitalist relation in the world, the displacement of millions of people, and the impoverishment, austerity, etc., etc. That's one thing. The other thing, which is the opposite, and this is the one, in a sense, that gives hope, it's also a use of Christianity that is not new, because it has a whole history in the 60s and 70s, but that history has left lots of seeds, which has been the development of liberation theology. And I was in Brazil, for example, and I met with people from the landless movement of Brazil, and as you know, the landless movement of Brazil is one of the many grassroots movements. They are an incredible movement. For years now, they have been engaged in land occupation, land recuperation, because this was their land, and building communities, building schools. They have recuperated thousands and thousands of hectares of land. On those places, they have built communities and schools, and what they have been practicing too is a sort of Christianity from below, a continuation of the base communities that proliferated. There were thousands and thousands of thousands in the 60s in Brazil alone, and many other thousands across Latin America. Base community that, translated Christianity in terms of, a view that enhanced solidarity among people. They took from Christianity the idea of love, solidarity, responsibility for each other, right? And struggle against injustice, struggle against what is destructive, what is injustice. And so they really politicized Christianity. It was a political theology, but very different from, of course, the theology that is being practiced by the Vatican and other Christian institutions, right? The idea when we are the body of Christ, we are the body of Christ, and we are the ones who practice the sacraments, and what keeps us together is really the love that we have for each other, the solidarity, and this is what it means, to be a good Christian. Much of that still continues, still is alive today, although not as strong given the very repressive politics that is being implemented, and given the advance of Protestant fundamentalist sects, but still is there, and I see that much more in continuum with the perspective that is put forward by many feminists, which is looking for forms of spirituality that do not presume an authoritarian power structure at any level, neither on earth nor in the sky. Thank you very much.
I already have a lot of questions, and I know you all probably do as well. But first, I want to give you both a chance to talk a little bit amongst yourselves, continue the conversation you've been having, what stands out from your respective kind of comments.
Well, so one of the questions that came up again earlier in the panel on anti-war activism was about an understanding, self-understanding of the oppressed. The way you talked about religion in both of the points that you made, the instrumentalization of religion, the compromise with power, and one could argue that there's been more than a compromise, there's also been an exercise of power. In other words, the church, and not only the church, but again, let's call it Christianity for now, has exercised power in, as I like to remind people, in the Middle Ages, it's not just the Pope that was a Christian, the Emperor was also a Christian. And so Christianity is the Pope and the Emperor, not just the Pope, not just the so-called religious people. And so in the exercise of power, one does not understand religion as just an instrument, but rather as and I said religion, I meant Christianity. Christianity is a form of power, right? And in the second point that you made, religion, spirituality, liberation theology is a possible resource. At the same time, and perhaps my question has more to do with Caliban and the witch, the importance and the insistence on the connection that you make between women, the destruction of witches as a destruction of the social power of women, and primitive accumulation, the transformation of structures of power. One can also, and again, there's some simplification at work in suggesting that race appears, very much appears in your analysis, but more marginally. No. One could read your work as foregrounding the violence perpetrated against women, as opposed to the other violence that you're equally interested in, which is the violence perpetrated by capitalism, the domination perpetrated by capitalism, for which the subject, right, the collective, would not be called women, although women occupy a particular place in that economy. And what you say about reproduction and the way in which Marxism does not take into account the accumulation that is reproductive labor is, of course, very much to the point. But the possibility for collectives to recognize themselves at the bottom, as it were, as the true oppressed, is, to my mind, one of the ways in which new enclosures are articulated. And I'm wondering whether you can speak to that. What happens when, by way of an understanding which may or may not be Marxist, but often is, one enters into a debate as to what the subject of domination is. The question I'm asking is probably just a question of solidarity, but you offer something else than solidarity. You offer an understanding whereby the violence against women is very much part of a process of primitive accumulation. In other words, we must understand the social function of capitalism by way of women as a subject of domination and violence. What happens when other subjects come in, either with a similar understanding, the obvious one is the proletariat, but another would be race, and particularly the black race, to go closer to my home, the Jews. The Jews as the ultimate victim of eternal anti-Semitism. In other words, where one engage in what is otherwise called as a competition of victim, and something that can produce what do you offer us to think otherwise about the subject of domination, of the oppressed, not in fact as new enclosures, but as a possibility for solidarity. And I agree with you, actually, that race is not marginal in your work, but one could understand that by focusing on witches, you give precedence to sexual violence as opposed to others. I'm glad you disagree.
No. No, read the book again. No, the book, this is beyond the question of where to start. Well, I wrote that book. I wrote the book because I was involved in the women's movement, and we were trying to understand the roots of women's oppression, exploitation, coming, all of us, or the people I was working with, the women I was working with, from a kind of leftist, generally Marxist, but perspective. And so we were looking for understanding, examining our position, and then we started looking at the sacred books, and we didn't find anything that could explain, because the sacred books never, I meant by Marx Capital, I didn't mean the Bible. So we couldn't find anything about reproduction, about children, about sexuality, about anything. And there were women, and children, but only when they went into a factory. So we realized that, in fact, the history of capitalist development that the Marxist tradition had given us was extremely limited. Extremely limited. They had left out a huge area of exploitation. And I must add, Marx, the Capital, neither Capital nor other books speak of slavery. I just went through again the Grundrisse, which is the book that Marx wrote preparing for Capital. And I found 4 references to slave labor, and only one to the American plantation. All the others have to do with slave labor in a different context. So that's motivated the book. So I realized, the history of capitalism has been told in a very limited way. So let me try to see what happened to these areas that we were discovering as important, like reproductive work, domestic work, child raising, sexual relation, the family. Let's see what happened in the history of capitalist development. So I began to work, and I went back to the Middle Ages, and it was fantastic. That was one of the best experiences because the Middle Ages I encountered erratic movements. I realized, for instance, that throughout Europe there was huge struggles of peasants, and that those struggles spoke of their vision of the world, with the language of religion. But it was the language of heresy, and they were burned, they were persecuted, they were killed, like the Jews. They were burned, persecuted. These were the Valdensians, these were the Cathars, and they had a conception. They said, Christ had no property. Christ had no property. Why the church is making us pay for everything? Why they're making us pay for everything? And they had a vision of solidarity. And among the Cathars, for instance, women could administer the sacraments. And among the Valdensians, even today in Italy, which is where I come from, there are churches, Valdensian churches. Some of my friends, I have a woman who is my friend, who is a minister in a Valdensian church. So a very different conception of what religion is. And then, in doing this work, in going through the century, I encountered the witch hunts. And I realized that the witch hunts, I always heard about witches, but as probably many people on this planet, they thought the witches were legendary creatures. They didn't know that thousands and thousands of women were arrested, tortured in the most brutal way. I mean, I spent nights, I couldn't sleep, reading what they'd done to them by men of the church, as well as men of the state. And I read what the demonologists wrote about women, right? There was an extension, always quoting the Bible, Eve, the one who brings evil into the world. And they had a whole story about why women are more easily seduced by the devil than men. It's because women are really not truly human. They are not reasonable, they are dominated by their passion, they are instinctually uncontrollable, they are so lusty that they copulate with it. I mean, an incredible story, a war against women. And I realized, looking at the chronology, looking at the context, this is the time of the beginning of the slave trade. This is the time when the peasantry was being expelled from their lands in Europe. This is the time of the conquest of America. And I realized, well, these witch hunts are part and parcel of the foundation of the modern capitalist system. And of course, there's all kinds of racist element, in the iconography of the witch, The devil is the black man. I mean, all kinds of things. So it's not. And then I looked. The book ends with looking at the intersection of all these processes, in Latin America, and with population that were being colonized and enslaved. So in fact, there's quite a bit of race. But more to the point, one of the themes of the book is that capitalism is not only production of exploitation and production of, but it's production of scarcity, which I think is very important and not enough realized, but it's production of these inequalities. This is why you have a system that is fundamentally unjust, that has brought misery, and a displacement, impoverishment to millions of people across the century, world wars, massacre, extermination. This is why it can sustain itself, because it's been very effective in creating, hierarchies and divisions, so that those who have been the victims of it have found it much more difficult to not only much more difficult to unite, but in some cases, some have been used to dominate the others. Men dominate women, white to dominate blacks, etc., etc. So the whole issue of subverting racism and sexism, that to me are not something else from capitalism. Racism and sexism are really structural, not structural elements only, but structural necessities of capitalism. Because they allow for a whole division of labor, for a particular type of division of labor that has been very instrumental in, incrementing the accumulation of capital. So this is the vision in the book. And of course, religion is through and through and through, all through the book, because religion, you're right, absolutely right. It's been the exercise of power. I come from Italy, and I know the Vatican was a power. They had a lot of the Italian territory. The Vatican had armies. There were popes, they were at the head of armies. And it was only with the unification of Italy that the Vatican was reduced to a small piece of land. But before, they had a huge amount of land. They covered, the Vatican State was quite a good part of central Italy was the Vatican State. And it was as much of a power as many others. So, yes, the issue of race is as important as the issue of sex, but these are not separate issues. These are not separate issues. These are really different forms of exploitation that unfortunately have been organized in such a way as to, foment division. But that's the struggle. I think that's the struggle that we're all in, right? To reunite what this society has divided.
So can I ask a question? And then I'll see if you have, no, this is fantastic. See if you have anything you'd like to ask and open it up to you all. One of the things I'm struck by, I mean, you mentioned the thing of like the subversion from within, and Gil, I love the way you kind of name on the one hand, the critique of the kind of the potentialities for universalizing and the way Christianity has universalized itself and the importance of localization, but how to do that localizing without creating new enclosures in ways that reproduce the same. And I guess one of the things I'm wondering about is what to do there. And one of the things, as someone who grew up in and is a part of this thing that calls itself Christianity, right? And not only this thing that it calls itself Christianity, but this thing that calls itself Christian theology. What that means from the inside, whatever that means, right? And what I'm curious to hear more about, and I love the language of translation, like the need for it and the worries about it. And I'm curious I would love to hear if you all have any thoughts about navigating that tension between subversion and destruction, which is obviously a conversation that is not a new one. But I hear that tension in the conversation already and how to do that. Not that that's something we can do and then fix, but how to hold in that space. Because one of the things that strikes me about, well, I think there is very much a tendency towards, but I think what does it mean for those of us, again, in this thing that calls itself this tradition, to reckon with that history, how to do that internal critical work, while at the same time not reproducing yeah.
I just said that I think it's a question of how many languages can we learn. It does seem to me increasingly imperative that we become, and of course that's one of the powerful dimensions of Marxism, that we become conversant in the language of economy, right now in the language of finance. Now, as with every language learning, part of the problem is how well do you speak it, and in both sense of the term. If you speak it too well, then it starts speaking you. If you don't speak it well enough, then you cannot engage with it. I think that's why I remain close. I mean, that's one of the reasons I remain close to Derrida. The necessity of translation has to be connected to the impossibility of translation. But aside from the language of finance, which I think we have to learn, and it seems to me from within Christianity, and I think the only piece of autobiographical writing I have produced is the one that is called Why I'm Such a Good Christian, which is also why I started by saying Shabbat Shalom, because there is a problem. Yes, there is a question of how much of me is a Christian, good or bad, yes. That is the question. And how many languages does a Christian, and it is a problem to constantly think of individuals. I believe in those less and less. To how many languages to learn? I do want to say that another way of asking the question I was asking you quite badly, yes, and I take your disagreement, I take the point, is how do we think about Islam? The fact that there are concentration camps in China, in India, in the United States, that are targeting Muslims. And Muslims, if I may refer again to the conversation yesterday and to Desmond Coleman paper, who was insisting on the very important distinction between blackness and the black body politic. In other words, between people and whatever is produced in order to govern or destroy them. And in this case, Islam does double duty. But the globalization of Islamophobia today calls for an analysis that I do not know yet a language. Political theology has done a lot of work for me in trying to understand, right? After the King's Two Bodies, I tried to suggest that the enemies has two bodies as well, the Jew and the Muslim, that body being divided as well between race and religion. But I'm not satisfied. In other words, it's not enough as an analysis. And so the question of some urgency today would be, what is Islam? To quote the title of an important book, what is Islam that it has become a global problem, right? And where to put that in all the other enclosures, new enclosures, whereby certain kinds of violences are recognized, other kinds of violences are not recognized. And so one language to learn, and I think it's a French scholar, Dubuisson, who says, what if instead of talking about religions, we talked about different kinds of dharmas? Right? What if we just use that term instead? What would happen? Right? If we used a foreign word, and I'm not necessarily advocating this, as you know, translation, again, possible, impossible. It's amazing how in some conversation everybody has the Abrahamic God, but then in some conversation we have to talk about Allah. Right? It's amazing how some people wear veils and then suddenly some people wear hijab. And the non-translation of the term, of course, is part of both an incorporation and exclusion. But the translation is not less problematic, yes? Because to say we all have the same God is a nice idea, but it doesn't always work. And it does work that we may not want to have done. So again, translation possible and impossible. And we need to learn all kinds of languages, and perhaps we need to let go of our language. Having tried, not entirely succeeded, to stop speaking one of the colonial languages I inherited, you know, to the extent my experience speaks to anything, it's hard. But to divest oneself of one's language might be one way to start as an exercise in translation, and to find oneself translated in a different language. I like to joke that once the IMF, the UN, and the World Bank are relocated to Tehran, then maybe we can stop speaking about the West. Because until then, I do think that the integrity of the Christian West is somehow buttressed by institutional forces.
It touches on so many things that I don't know. First of all, I don't talk about the West. I don't think we should talk about the West. I edited a book called Enduring Western Civilization, which was a critique of the idea that there is such a thing as the West. If we look at the map of the world, we see that there is no such a thing as the West. And except relatively speaking. So the West is really a political concept. Actually, Columbia University was very much responsible for cooking up the idea of the West. Around World War I, they introduced a famous course on Western civilization. I think it was one of the first courses on Western civilization, which had to do with basically building anti-communism and also explaining why the United States would be involved in Europe in the war, etc., etc. And there's really no concept of the West until the 19th century, and it's a really politically constructed concept. They usually, had to do with empire, with the building of empire, and then the West came to be a kind of euphemism for capitalism, right? And then it was anti-Bolshevik, etc., etc. So I suggest let's not talk about the West. But all I want to say here is that locality is very important. And the issue of translation. I think it's very important to figure out that I want to use here a slogan that I've become very attached to. It's a slogan by the Zapatista communities in Chiapas, where they say, one no, many yeses. One no, many yeses. One no is no to injustice, no to exploitation. No, that's the universal. That's the universal. The universal, we generalize in terms of, deciding what is not acceptable. Many yeses mean the human beings on this planet have so many history of struggle, geographical position, history of social reality transformation, culture. So there are so many ways to implement the good life, to implement a society that is not based on destruction, human exploitation. There are many, many ways that have to do with culture, with languages, and so on. And that's, of course, not only is acceptable, but it's necessary. And to have a universalizing conception of what a good society could be, it would be disastrous. But then there are some universal, no to human oppression, no to exploitation. That should be the only one. I want to say something about Islam. First of all, there are many Islams. There's not one Islam. There's a whole work by feminists, from Egypt to Africa, and I know a lot of women who are working on Islam to show how much of what is being said is Islam is not really Islam. And then, of course, the whole issue of Islamophobia and what Islam means for the United States State Department. And I think it means petroleum. That, the way the fight against Islam has been used politically to, extend U.S. power over the Middle East. I think that might sound like a little crude, but I think there's a lot to it. That Islamophobia is not really an attack on a religion. It's an instrument for exerting exploitation, demonizing entire populations, who in fact would have claim to the wealth produced on their soil, have a claim to the wealth produced on their soil, and instead the wealth has now over and over and over been robbed from them. So that's the Islam. And then, of course, there's the Islamic fundamentalism, which is a new form of fundamentalism that I think is being produced for political purposes by higher up in the Islamic State. And, this is the one that many feminists are rejecting. They're saying this has nothing to do with what some of the best of Islam has been really about. I'll stop here.
Should we open it up? Karen, I'm waiting for the mic to run. Karen?
Thank you. Hi, this question's for Professor Federici. I'm David, a student here at Union. You mentioned your recent trip to Brazil.
Yes.
I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the synod taking place currently, in the Vatican, the Synod of Bishops on the Amazon region, and the relationship between, on the one hand, a church that sees itself possibly as a counterweight to Bolsonaro and political violence in indigenous communities, and on the other, is itself hierarchical and has a history of that very same violence against those communities.
Okay, so maybe we should pick up a few more.
Hi, thank you both. I'm Karen Bray, and I was thinking a lot about Gil's opening about the absences in our opening plenary session, and thinking with that how Silvia began with saying, as someone who's done feminist work, and one of the big absences we had that was not mentioned by Gil is on gender. And even though I think Nakia mentioned that because she's a black woman, she has to do the political with the religious, that was it. And as someone who identifies first as a feminist and then as a political theologian, this is an indictment to myself as one of the people on that panel. And we even talked about having a gender balance on that panel, but that did not mean gender came into the conversation. So, you know, if religion and Christianity and modernity are all racial ideologies, they're obviously all gender ideologies as well. And yet that does not seem to be the frame in which we began this conference. At some of the other panels, it definitely came up, but not in this large frame the way race and capitalism and colonialism have. And so I guess my question is, my fear from the opening plenary that I expressed, which is I'm not sure the frame of political theology can ever be fully decolonized of its whiteness and Christianity. We could add masculinity to that as well. And this is sort of a question for the panelists, but also for everyone in this room. If political theology is itself a new enclosure, does it also mean that we have to closet off some of ourselves to have proper access to that new enclosure? So last night we were talking about, can you be a feminist and a political theologian, or why should a feminist be a political theologian? And as someone who identifies as both, I had not a good answer to that. So I just want to raise that for the room to think about.
Okay, I had something that I was thinking about, but it might actually connect with what you're saying as well. The first thing I'll say is it possible that political theology actually allows for an expansion of theorizing that might possibly be more inclusive and really push toward more intersectionality? That's open, but so I'm going to try to answer that maybe a little bit, but then pose it back as a question to you all, particularly Dr. Federici. So I've been playing with a theory. I've been putting your work and the work of social reproduction feminists in conversation with something that I got from womanist theorist Katie Cannon, where she drew on Marxian theory and history to look at, to really argue back at race being a labor category that developed in the course of colonialism. And so social reproduction feminism tries to, look at one social ontology, both materially and ideologically. And so I've been playing with that. So I've been taking liberties with what you did with your history in Caliban and the Witch and trying to tease out theoretically, and I think this might get to some of what you're saying, that maybe there are these categories that the witch is, yes, it is a sex category and a gender category, but it's also a political category because it's a rebel. It is a thing or a person who refuses to be conquered, at least initially. And so it becomes evil, it becomes demonized, and you referred to many times the fact that early on that category was associated with blackness, by the church, by the medieval church. And so I'm wondering if it's possible to kind of tease out these, maybe like the docile laborer versus the rebel, and that those categories then become easily applied in any situation that is useful to capitalism, essentially. And so that you can divide people that way, you can divide ethnicities, you can divide even among women, you can do all kinds of things with those categories.
Well, yeah, I find it very interesting, and yet part of me, your question about the Amazon, interesting, good, but also a lot of suspicion. I want to see, what is following up. I know that, the real hope or the real strength comes from the indigenous communities who are there and who are fighting against it, and I wonder to what extent this is a publicity stunt, so to speak, and to what extent it's really commitment. Because, the struggle is there. There is a tremendous struggle all through Brazil, Bolsonaro or no Bolsonaro. In fact, Bolsonaro is because of the struggle. It's very important to see that this move to the right, it's an attempt to put the lid on a struggle that is happening at every corner, not only in the Amazon, it's happening in the urban areas. That's why so many, leaders like Marielle Franco, etc., of urban movements have been assassinated, and my concern is it's again that the hope is put above. The hope is put in the Savior that comes from outside, whereas I believe the real hope is what is built from below. And I don't know if you want to make comments on this. Yeah. Then the second question is whether political theology is a form of new enclosure or can be decolonized. Who raised the question of gender? But this was a question for the room, right? So it was not a question necessarily for me. It was more like, let's think about what this thing is implying. And what about the witch? The witch, yeah. She's not just a white woman. The witch was, also a woman, an indigenous woman, a black woman. I was in Bahia when I was in Brazil. Among the places I went was Bahia, and I was with a lot of black women and women from quilombolas, from quilombos, and women were studying. A woman, Caterina Roja, who has studied the witch hunts in Bahia, in the Bahia area, and slave women were among the targets, of accusation of witchcraft, because all the African religion and ritual and so on, right, were charged with being, signs of witchcraft, and worse, they were, elements of the resistance. They enabled people to resist. And so the women who practiced them, they're accused of being witches. The witch is an indigenous woman, right? The witch is represented as a cannibal. So the connection, in fact, that's something very important. It's very rarely brought out, that throughout the 16th and 17th century, there was a constant communication between inquisitors who were in Latin America and inquisitor and magistrates who were in Europe, and were exchanging concept, ideas, forms of torture, forms of persecution. And so you find that the witch in Europe is represented as a cannibal, right? Which is really taken from the whole lore of the imperial conquest of Latin America. Yeah, I did reply to the Amazon. Yeah. Oh, there was another thing. Sorry. Yeah, quickly that, race and gender and so on for me are labor category, are political category. No, they're nothing to do with biology, obviously, but it's just important to say that. And they represent particular form of exploitation, particular form. And I think that all the intersectionality has been a very powerful concept because it has allowed to realize that you don't just add up different forms of oppression, but you always have a new reality. Oh, you're right, you have it. No, but I think you should.
Hi, my name is Gabrielle, and I'm a first-year MDiv student at Union, and I am so excited to be here. This is my first time in an academic conference, so I'm absorbing a lot and feeling like my brain is exploding in all these wonderful ways. And I'm also curious about, as someone who isn't necessarily interested in pursuing a PhD or going into academia, I'm excited to apply what I'm hearing here and in other spaces at Union to, for example, my own path of pursuing ministry within the Christian church. And I would love to hear the panelists, your thoughts on how do we take these very oftentimes intellectual and perhaps even abstract ideas, and even for those of us who are in academic spaces, how do we apply these very I would argue revolutionary concepts in our day-to-day work? I'm personally curious to hear your thoughts on within a ministerial context, but also beyond that, like how can we really ground these ideas in practical action? So thank you.
Hi, Alex Dubele. Thank you. I'm curious if you could speak across the kind of the main concepts. On one side, primitive accumulation and enclosures, and on the other side, kind of the power of the secular, the way Christianity kind of renames. How do we think kind of those two clusters of ideas, that kind of broadly, let's say, critique of the secular and the way that Christianity is related to it, and on the other side, this kind of perpetual enclosures that form kind of capitalist accumulation? Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay.
I'll answer the first and you answer the second. I can only tell you what I'm doing, and you know, that because it's big, depending on where you are and depending, and you know, your situation. I'm right now involved with a group of women in New York. And we are looking into the relationship between the new forms of violence against women and the great rise of violence against women. And when I mean women, I mean all women, including trans women, women or trans who identify themselves as women. So not in an exclusive way, but on the contrary. And the new forms of organizational work and capitalist accumulation, how the economic intersects with these new forms of violence, because this is the area, not because it's the only area or the most important, but because it's the area that we can speak to more powerfully, because it's more related to our experience, which is, I think, my methodology. And one of the things that we are looking at, for example, is there is a whole process now taking place in the United States, which is criminalizing pregnancy for women who are racialized, Afro-descendant, or immigrant, Latina, or don't have many economic resources, poor women, what is called generally poor. I don't like the word poor because is a naturalizing word. Let's say impoverished women. So there is a criminalization. I think the few people are aware of it. Most are aware of all the restrictions that have been placed on abortion, and the fact that abortion is the big, and I agree, is very important. What is not being understood is that as a woman here in New York, a national health advocate, Lynn Paltrow, put it. Today, if you are poor, if you are black, if you are Latina, and you decide to have a child, you put yourself outside of the Constitution, because you become vulnerable to all kinds of charges that would be unthinkable in terms of other persons. You know, like women have been arrested for being in a car accident and telling the police that they were pregnant. Right? Telling the police they were pregnant, they were arrested because they put the fetus in danger. So the whole question, which in fact intersects with religion, right, about the fetus, the rights of the fetus. Of course, we know that once the fetus becomes a child, once the child is born, nobody cares for the child. They only care for the fetus as long as it stays in the belly of the woman. But they're using the rights of fetuses now to accuse women who are not, of course, women who have, power, who have some social power, right? But they're using it as a form, I say, as a form of sterilization, as a form of deciding who can reproduce and who cannot reproduce. So that is something that, it's a very, very important, it's a part of the life and death struggle in life and death decision making, that in fact this society, this government, these politicians, are, doing. Who is allowed to live, who should die? Who is allowed to live, who should be incarcerated? Who is allowed to live, who should pass a life of misery? So there's a tremendous amount of work to be done. I think you have to find your place and to see what kind of struggle you can speak best to. We cannot speak to all struggle. We cannot speak to all forms of exploitation. But we have to speak from what we know, which doesn't mean that we do not connect with other people. But we have to speak to the ones where we can be most powerful because it connects with our own experience. That's it.
I'm grateful for the question about abstraction because I suppose one of the reasons why I'm in this line of work is because I've never understood the difference between abstract and concrete. If I call this a table, am I being concrete or am I being abstract? It's not a table, yes? It's this. At which point am I abstracting too much? Of course, I'm the last person to give you any advice as to how to be practical. That is absolutely the case. Though the practice which I'm still having difficulties identifying with, namely the fact that I stand in something that is called a classroom and what is taking place is supposed to be called teaching, but what concerns me more is whether any learning happens and whether it could actually be my fault or my responsibility, and I'm not clear on that. But one thing that does happen is to the extent that I teach something, I suppose I teach reading, which, as Silvia mentioned earlier, I do quite badly, which is also one reason why I tell my students that they should read everything they read a few hundred times. And having read Caliban and the Witch only a few times, I recognize that it is not enough. Having said that, because I'm interested in reading as a practice, which is not necessarily a communicative practice, and that's part of the problem, I'm interested in translation. I'm also interested in the fact that certain words are used. Now, is it concrete to speak about immigration, as it has become the norm in Europe, certainly since about 1979? Is it concrete to speak about Muslims in Europe, the same people that before 1979 and certainly before 1989 were actually called migrant workers? The same people who were never welcome to be integrated and which once they were designated as Muslims in 1979, hopefully you know why I'm mentioning those dates, and 1989, were then identified as Muslims and as people who refused to integrate. And what is the nature of those words, those concrete words or not concrete words, ideal, abstract, whatever? I don't know. I don't know. We all talk about immigration, and of course there's good reason for that, but we also seem to all think that it is a problem. Or at least there's enough people who have been convinced that it is a problem. The problem is immigration. The way you hear people say, the problem is religion. I actually think the problem are corporations, but that's just me. And then maybe to go back to the question on capitalism and primitive accumulation and the secular, I recognize that categories, as it were, call them abstractions. I, again, don't think that that's what they are, because they have institutional effects. They have truth effect, concrete effects, do not map easily onto each other. Right? Someone earlier, at this panel earlier today, said we all agree that "thou shalt not kill" is a principle that we all claim to believe in, and that's true. Yes, but of course, in order not to kill, in order to agree on that principle, we can also agree to advocate capital punishment for those who do. And part of the problem is, what does it mean to, in fact, agree on the principle? What does it mean to actually speak concretely about something that is otherwise considered an abstraction, like a principle? And translation is my only answer, and of course it's not an answer. But the categories don't map onto each other. But as long as we think that Christianity and capitalism are two distinct things, I think we're making a mistake. Now, how to do the work to demonstrate that mistake, not to mention the practicalities of explaining that, having tried my hand at it and being still convinced that I am not the greatest of communicators, all I can say is that I don't think I've succeeded. But, fail, try again, I can go on, I go on.
Both of you touched upon the issue of harm and wrong done to many, female bodies and Jewish bodies and Muslim bodies and so on by Christian traditions. So, my question is, how much credit would you give to the value or possibility of immanent criticism from within, not necessarily from outside Christian tradition? Yeah.
They might be hungry. Any more questions? Okay.
Thank you both so much. I'm really grateful for everything you've been saying. I wonder if you could maybe talk a bit more about this relationship between participating in different kinds of material struggles. You mentioned this earlier, Silvia, Federici, and Gil Anidjar too. You have this attention to the concrete, and that motivates these reflections. And I'm just curious maybe to hear a little bit more about that interplay between the motivations of looking at things on the ground, political problems of people being enclosed, etc., and what that means for going back into these different archives that you've both mined, both the archives of Marx and finding what is or is not there, the archives of Christian tradition and other traditions to see what's there and not there too. So yeah, if you could just say something more about how these two relate, seeing these struggles on the ground and also that reflective work of theorizing what it might mean to engage those struggles, with these tools that you have.
And just to follow up on that conversation, is there a possibility to consider the theorizing itself concrete, rather than the concrete and the abstract being something separate? I think there's always a relationship, and I think that comes through in Marx more than anyone else.
To throw another one onto the pile, how do we think about discussing traditions that are not Christianity if Christianity is linked to capitalism and linked to coloniality, which is total, right? So I guess I'm just having difficulty conceptualizing how to speak of anything without getting away from Christianity.
I'm not sure I understand the first question. How do you deal with criticism of Christianity from within?
So maybe you can ask a person of faith to live up to your own ideal rather than criticize the person by applying criteria foreign to the person, maybe. Yeah, so yeah, maybe we can criticize Christians to live up to your own criteria or your own norms. So I'm not necessarily necessarily saying that that is enough, or you can that's enough and you can shut down yourself from others' voices. But I wonder how much credit would you give to that kind of practice, or, you know?
You know, I tend to be less critical of individual than I am of institution, because I felt that most of the time, you know, the belief that individuals have such complex motivation behind them. And so to me, it's always much more important to look at what are the structures, the social, economic, religious, cultural structures that are creating certain patterns. And so that's the way. So, you know, otherwise I try to listen and hear also where people are coming from, because the same words are not always necessarily carrying the same concerns. And I know this is not a direct answer, but it's the best I can give. And, you know, I don't, you want to answer?
I mean, you said immanent critique. Part of the problem is, seconding the point about the individual, it's complicated. But every time I speak, I have to ask myself whether, I mean, what it would mean to say I am speaking. I did not invent the language that I speak, and I have been spoken before I've even begun to say anything. And to be perfectly clear, one of the things I found out early on when I started working at this institution on the other side of the wall, which, you know, for whatever it's worth, was to understand what we call a private university in this country. A private university in this country is a university that receives $300 million from the Pentagon, which, unless I'm mistaken, is not private money. 300 million is the number that was mentioned by President Bollinger in one of the first statements he made as a president, to actually talk about the possibility of retaliation if the demands of students that ROTC not be allowed to recruit at the law school were implemented. Then $300 million from the budget of the university would actually be pulled by the government, most of it coming from the Pentagon. And as Bollinger said, the university would be crippled. So since then, I've taken to identify myself as a worker of the Pentagon. And I know that everything I say is radical and subversive, but I work for the Pentagon, so you should take it with a grain of salt. Now, is it me? Should I do a mea culpa every morning? Yes, no, I don't know. But the problem is, what does it mean to be spoken through and to be given a stage? So immanent critique, the reason why I said I'm such a good Christian is because I wish I could say I am not, right? But I don't know. And so that's where I am. I'm losing track of the questions.
There's one about archives, and that one is particularly important for me because I'm really into the story of archives right now. You know, yeah, I think it's very. I mentioned before that I'm involved in this project of recuperating the history of the witch hunt, and after this happened with women in Spain, after we took some trips to these towns and we saw the way the witch hunts were represented and the way they were used, like we decided, okay, we got to do something. And one that we did was to create a number. We decided to do history from below, and I've been creating a number of study groups and women going to their localities, and particularly Catalonia, Basque Country, and there was another place near Asturia, where they had persecution, and they go to the archives and they take out the document and they look at them. And that has already been very powerful. We had a meeting in March, where the first meeting of all the study groups, and it was very powerful because, you know, women who had walked their children on a square, they didn't know that on that square women had been burned. And who were these women? And just mentioning the names, right? And then the connection, of course, with the present. What did the persecution mean? What happened because those women were killed? And the connection with what is happening today. So I think that archival work connects directly, very, very, very directly. We're already seeing that with political practice, you know, and just following on this, theorizing is, to me, very concrete. It's putting things together. When we are together and we're analyzing our experience, we're analyzing what is happening, what are the issues of debt, for example. So many people now have debt. There's the national debt, which has consequences for your life, and then there's your individual debt. Why we have that now? How to speak in those experiences? That's theorizing, so that's really important. There's another question, but you know, you want to add something on the archives and theorizing.
Yeah, I mean, it's an accurate word, archive, but I do worry because my historians, colleagues, certainly don't think that what I do has anything to do with any legitimate archive. And part of my struggle against the historical profession is the universal, actually imperial claim. And different disciplines make different imperial claims. History has been particularly successful. Like, go tell someone that there's something that does not belong to history. I'm always surprised that religion hasn't actually managed to say, we were there when the Big Bang happened. We are, in fact, in charge of everything. We should talk about everything. Much better than the historians ever could, because they think, you know, I mean, I don't even know what it is they think. Yes, theorization is concrete and it's important work, but it needs to make sense. And what I was saying about language is that it often feels that we are, and I'll speak again from the institutional place where I am located, that we are kind of museum pieces. You know, as you know, there were indigenous people that were put in museums alive, yes, and I without comparing too much, but I do think that we are museum pieces. And the question of what possibilities for those of us who look into archives, whatever those archives are, to present ourselves as something else than museum pieces is part of the difficulty, the corridors of communication. I mean, I know all of you are activists, but I can't claim that. And some of the paths of communication have been broken before I was even taught jargon.
Okay, then there was a question about how to connecting with traditions that are not Christianity. Well, I think you connect, you know, I think you connect by, well, I am already beyond Christianity, so for me I'm open to other traditions as I'm open to hear what people who are from Christianity have to say. But it seems to me that this is part of being able to communicate from people who come from different experiences. And I think if you're not committed to using other people, if you're not committed to exploiting other people, and you know, you can only look to other people as a wealth, as a form of enrichment, I think this is one of the struggles. At this moment now, we live in a society with a tremendous amount of effort and money and energy is being employed to make people think that they are little islands and they should be little islands and they should build walls around themselves and think of their interests. Think of their interests first, because other people are a danger. You know, you cannot trust them, and or they will hurt you in some way or the other. And I think that this is really a program that you know, has been part of the DNA of a capitalist society, because if you convince people that they are alone, that they are a small island without walls and without windows, then it's much more easy to defeat them, right? I mean, what is happening now in Latin America has been very, very inspirational. And, you know, enchanting the world, the second part of the book, is very much inspired by a lot of what I've seen both in Africa and in Latin America, which is the building of new forms of communalism, often by people who have been pushed out of their ancestral land. You know, from the rural area, they go to the periphery of town, take over land, take over territory, they build houses, they build everything. And women are very, very crucial to that process. And, you know, they can do that. They can do that because they know the power of collective work and the power of collective relation. If they were alone, they know that being alone, of course there's a whole indigenous tradition, right? More than in any other parts of the world, I think the indigenous tradition of communalism is still somewhat alive. There are still many communal lands in Latin America. But there's also realization that if you are alone, you are defeated. You know, you are defeated, you have nothing. But together, you can also, you know, build, and there is a whole new social fabric that is being reconstructed. New forms of reproduction. Collective kitchen, urban garden, you know, places where children can be given a glass of milk, popular assembly where decision-making about one's life can be made collectively. All of that is happening. Support groups, support network, it's very powerful. And of course, they're up against, you know, tremendous forces, you know, like not only the Bolsonaro, but I mean, the United States is now supporting all the most repressive government in Latin America. But the response is there. The response is there. And I think the question of collectivity is really crucial. And not only in Latin America, here too. Oh, you haven't. I keep thinking. I've been in so many places where we pass around the mic.
Quickly, maybe? I mean, I can just say one thing about other traditions, and I hope I don't sound too reductive that when I speak about translation, I'm not being only linguistic. But nonetheless, to continue with with that particular notion, I think the question of other traditions is a question of translation. It is also a question of where should one seek. I mean, Silvia's point is absolutely correct. One cannot simply speak, we, whoever that we is in this case, cannot simply speak amongst ourselves. At the same time, to translate ourselves in order to not be alone is something that is not unproblematic for paranoid reasons, but also for other kinds of reasons. I could say, at least with some hesitation, that I speak slightly from a tradition that has actually managed to translate itself. It was called the Emancipation, somehow between 1791 and 1793. And sometimes in 1945, that tradition got, collated in such a way that translation had been fully successful, since we all know that there is such a thing as the Judeo-Christian tradition, which, as far as I'm concerned, is still Christianity, because from the Judeo side, the Judeo-Christian, it's a little like, as incorrect as it is to speak of the Hebrew Bible, it is, of course, more incorrect to speak of the Old Testament, because from the perspective of the readers of that text, it is not old and it is not a testament, yes? The problem is when the translation is successful, it becomes much more difficult to actually speak as if one is speaking from a place that is even remotely recognizable and articulable. So, yes and no. Translation, possible, necessary, and impossible.
Can you join me in thanking our panelists? I know there was much more to talk about, but hopefully folks can continue talking at lunch. At lunch, I'm going to hand this over to Roberto now to explain.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. And thank you, Brandy, for moderating such a great conversation. My name is Roberto Servent, and I'm helping organize the lunch portion of our Saturday together. So what we have are, we have some placards on, I think, 4 or 6 different parts of the room here, and it's just going to give all of you a chance to find ways to get plugged into the network. We have 8 different initiatives that will be hosted by different representatives of the Political Theology Network. The 8 initiatives are the Political Theology Network website, Future National Conference Planning, the Political Theology Network podcast, graduate student initiatives, the Political Theology Journal, the American Academy of Religion Political Theology Program Unit, outreach, and new initiatives. So what I'll do is I'll stand back there by all the lunch, all the food, and I'll hand out this menu that explains a little bit more about each initiative. And you'll also find a menu of these initiatives by each of the placards as well. So I'm excited to continue the conversation and to see ways we can get everybody plugged into the network. Thank you.
Thank you. Please enjoy lunch.